I almost didn't notice her. That's the part that still keeps me up at night. She was just a woman in a gray coat, sitting 2 tables away, stirring her coffee like she had nowhere to be. I remember thinking she looked tired. The kind of tired that lives behind your eyes, not on your face. I didn't know then that she was watching me. I didn't know that what she was about to do would be the only reason I'm still alive to tell you this. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Lauren. I'm 31 years old, and 8 months ago, I was the happiest I had ever been. I had just accepted a senior analyst position at a financial consulting firm called Hargrove & Associates, the kind of job you spend 6 years working toward, the kind that makes your mother cry at the dinner table in a good way. My boss, a man named Richard, had personally recruited me after seeing my work at my previous company. He was polished, confident, the type of man who made you feel like you were the most important person in the room. My colleagues warned me he was intense. I thought that was just what success looked like. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to know who's here with me tonight. It was a Tuesday in March when it happened. Richard had invited me to breakfast at a place called Oleander's, a quiet, upscale cafe downtown. He said he wanted to discuss my first major account before the afternoon meeting. I remembered checking my reflection in the elevator doors before I left the office. I had worn my good blazer. I wanted to make a strong impression. Richard was already seated when I arrived. He ordered for both of us before I sat down. Eggs Benedict, sparkling water, black coffee, and he smiled that boardroom smile and said, "I knew you'd be here on time. That's why I chose you, Lauren." We talked through the account for 20 minutes. Everything felt normal, professional. He slid a folder across the table partway through and said, "Standard NDA and authorization forms. Legal needs them signed before you can access the full client file." He was already talking about something else, already moving on, and I reached for the pen. That's when I felt it, a hand on my wrist, gentle but firm. I looked up. It was the woman in the gray coat. She was standing right beside our table, close enough that I could see the small scar above her eyebrow. She looked directly at me, not at Richard, and said very quietly, "Don't sign that." Then she walked away, out the door. Gone. The table went completely silent. Richard laughed first. A short, controlled laugh. "Ignore her," he said. "Probably confused you with someone else." He tapped the folder. "Take your time, of course. We can finish this back at the office." But something had shifted inside me. I don't know how to explain it except to say that my hand didn't want to pick up the pen anymore. I told Richard I'd review the documents before signing. "Standard practice," I said. "I always read everything." His smile stayed on his face, but it stopped reaching his eyes. That afternoon, I went home instead of back to the office. I told his assistant I had a migraine. I spread the documents across my kitchen table and started reading. 2 hours later, I was sitting on the floor. The NDA was not a standard NDA. Buried in the 3rd section, in language so dense and convoluted it read like a foreign country, was a clause that transferred full signatory authority on 3 client accounts to me personally, accounts I had never heard of, accounts that were not in any briefing file I had been given. If I had signed that document, I would have been legally responsible for any transactions made under those accounts. Legally. Personally. With no way to prove I hadn't authorized them myself. I pulled up the client names. 2 of them returned nothing. The 3rd returned a single result, a civil lawsuit filed in Delaware 4 years ago against a man named Douglas Hurst for financial fraud totaling over $6 million. Douglas Hurst, according to the court record, was a former employee of Hargrove & Associates. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called my friend Priya, who works in corporate law. I read her the clauses over the phone. She went quiet in a way that scared me. Then she said, "Lauren, whoever drafted this was counting on you not reading it. This is a liability transfer. If those accounts get flagged for fraud, you're the one who goes down for it." "Would Richard know that?" I asked. Another pause. Someone with his experience would absolutely know that. I went back through every interaction I'd had with Richard since joining the firm. The way he had personally selected me. The way he had rushed the account handoff. The way he had already been talking about the next thing before I even touched the pen. I thought about Douglas Hurst. I thought about whether I was the first person Richard had tried this with, or just the latest. I needed to know more, but I couldn't go to HR. Richard was on the board. I couldn't go to a regulatory body without proof, just my word against his. I needed the woman in the gray coat. I went back to Oleander's the next morning, and the morning after that. On the third morning, she was there. She was at the same table, same coffee, same stillness. I walked straight to her and sat down across from her without asking. She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "I wondered if you'd come back." Her name was Patricia. She was 63 years old. She had worked in financial compliance for 30 years before she retired, and before that, she had been the senior auditor at a firm where Richard had worked 15 years ago. Her daughter, she told me, her voice steady and careful, had taken a job at a firm Richard moved to 7 years later. Her daughter had signed something she didn't read. Patricia folded her hands around her coffee cup. "My daughter is not in prison," she said, "but only because we spent 4 years and everything we had proving she didn't understand what she was signing. She lost her license. She lost her career. She had a breakdown that she is still recovering from." She looked at me. "When I saw him walk in with you, I almost didn't say anything. I told myself it wasn't my place. Then I watched you reach for that pen, and I thought, I cannot do this again. I cannot watch it happen again." I asked her how many people she knew of. She said she had documented 7 across 4 different firms over 20 years. Analysts, associates, junior partners, always ambitious, always trusting, always new enough to the role to feel they couldn't push back. 7 people who had their careers destroyed so that the money could never be traced back to Richard. 7. And I would have been 8. We sat in that cafe for 3 hours. Patricia had kept everything, every document, every court filing, every piece of correspondence she had gathered over years of watching and waiting and not being believed. She had gone to regulators twice. Both times, Richard's attorneys had been faster. Both times, the case had collapsed before it started. "He's very good at this," she said. "He is very, very good at this." "Then we have to be better," I said. "Here's what I did not do. I did not confront Richard. I did not send emails. I did not talk to anyone at the firm. I understand how easily paper trails get buried and how quickly accusers become the accused when the other person has resources and reputation and 30 years of built trust. What I did was this. I went back to work the next day and I behaved exactly as normal. I apologized to Richard for not signing the documents, told him my head had been bad and I had rested, and asked if we could go through them together so I could make sure I understood the scope of my responsibilities. He seemed pleased. We scheduled time for the following week. In the meantime, I connected Patricia with Preya. The 3 of us spent 2 weeks building a picture. Preya identified which regulatory bodies had jurisdiction and which ones had received Richard's previous filings. Patricia provided the historical documentation. I, very carefully, used my legitimate access to the firm's shared drives to locate emails, not to take them, but to note their existence and timestamp them so that a subpoena would know exactly where to look. On a Friday afternoon in April, a federal financial crimes investigator named Agent Holt received a 47-page package, assembled by Preya, containing documented evidence of a pattern of fraudulent liability transfers across 4 firms over 2 decades, with Richard's name at the center of every single one. The package also included a formal request for a preservation order on all electronic records at Hargrove and Associates. The following Monday morning, I came to work. I sat at my desk. I opened my laptop. At 9:15, 3 men in suits walked past the glass wall of Richard's office. His assistant stood up. Richard opened his office door and looked out, and for just a moment, one single moment, his eyes found mine across the floor. I didn't look away. They escorted him out through the lobby. His attorney was on the phone before they reached the elevator. What came out in the investigation was worse than I had imagined, and also exactly as bad as Patricia had known for years. The accounts I had nearly signed for were shells, Dormant entities used to park money moved from legitimate client funds. Richard had been running the scheme since at least 2009. The 7 people Patricia knew about were confirmed. So were 3 more that investigators found on their own. 10 people. 10 careers gutted. Some had declared bankruptcy. 1 had lost custody of her children during the legal battle. 1 had moved out of the country. Richard's attorney argued he had no knowledge of how the documents were being used. The emails Priya had flagged for the subpoena told a different story. He was indicted on 14 counts. Patricia testified. She sat in that witness stand in the same careful, steady way she had sat across from me in the cafe, and she said her daughter's name out loud in a federal courtroom, and her voice only broke once. I was there for every day of it. There is something I want to say to you directly, whoever is watching this tonight. I think about the version of me that signed the pen. She was so close to real. She was right there, at that table, wanting to impress her boss, telling herself that this was just how things worked at this level, that she should trust the process, that big firms had legal teams for a reason. She would have signed that document and walked back into the office and found out what she'd done only when it was too late. One woman in a gray coat was the distance between those 2 versions of me. Patricia didn't know me. She had nothing to gain from stopping to say something. She had already been ignored twice. She had every reason to stir her coffee and look the other way. She chose not to. I asked her once, after everything, what made her stand up that morning. She said she had made herself a promise after her daughter's breakdown. She said, if I ever see it starting again, I will say something. Even if nothing comes of it, even if they look at me like I'm crazy, I will say something. So let me ask you, if you had seen what Patricia saw, would you have said something? And if you are the one sitting across the table from someone who is about to sign something they haven't read, you can say something too. Even quietly. Even if it's just wait. Just wait. Read everything. Ask for time. If someone makes you feel that there is no time to understand what you are agreeing to, that is the moment to slow down, not to speed up. Your signature is not a formality. It is your name on something that will exist long after that moment. I still work in finance. Different firms, smaller team. Every document triple read before I touch a pen. Richard's case goes to sentencing later this year. Patricia and I have coffee every other Thursday at Oleander's. She always orders the same thing. She still looks a little tired. But it's different now. The kind of tired that comes after a long thing is finally finished. I understand that completely. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've ever had a moment where a stranger said something that changed everything, I want to hear about it in the comments. Because I don't think Patricia and I are the only ones. I have thought a lot about what would have happened if Patricia had looked away. It would have been so easy for her to do that. She had already tried to stop men like Richard before. She had already been ignored, dismissed, outmaneuvered. She had every rational reason to sit at her table and drink her coffee and tell herself that this was not her problem, that she had done her part, that the world does not reward people who speak up. And yet she stood up anyway. She crossed a room full of strangers and put her hand on my wrist and said 2 words that changed the entire direction of my life. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most significant things one human being can do for another. What I keep coming back to is this. The choices that define us are almost never the dramatic ones. They are the quiet ones, the ones nobody sees. The moment you decide to say something when staying silent would have cost you nothing. The moment you slow down when every pressure around you is telling you to hurry up. The moment you choose to read what is in front of you instead of trusting that someone else has already made it safe. Richard built his entire operation on the assumption that people would not do those things. He counted on ambition making people careless. He counted on authority making people compliant. He counted on the fact that in a room full of professionals, a new employee would not want to be the one who paused and said, "Wait, I need to understand this first." He had done it 10 times. It had worked 10 times. The only variable he had not accounted for was a 63-year-old woman who had already watched it destroy someone she loved and had promised herself she would never let it happen again without saying something. That is what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not a grand gesture, a promise kept in a quiet cafe on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I think about the 7 people who came before me, the ones Patricia knew about, the ones who lost their licenses and their savings, and in some cases their families. They were not foolish people. They were not careless people. They were people who trusted a system and a person who had learned exactly how to exploit that trust. The difference between them and me was not intelligence or caution. It was one woman who chose to act on what she knew instead of carrying it alone. And I think about what it means to carry something alone for as long as Patricia did, gathering documents, filing complaints that went nowhere, watching the same pattern repeat in different offices with different names. That takes a specific kind of strength that does not ask for recognition. She did not stop because nobody was listening. She kept building the record because she understood that truth does not expire. Evidence does not expire. And when the right moment came, everything she had preserved was exactly what was needed. What Richard did will follow him, not because the universe balances scales in any mystical sense, but because patterns leave traces, and traces accumulate, and people like Patricia exist who are patient enough to wait for the moment when those traces become undeniable. Your signature is not a formality. Your attention is not a courtesy. And the person across the table who tells you there is no time to read what you are agreeing to, that person is telling you something true. They are telling you that time is the one thing they cannot afford to give you. That is the moment to take all of it.